So last night, in an effort to fix a bug in my XInclude processor, I broke things so I couldn't rebuild my slides. I fixed that this morning, and then at lunchtime, dropped my laptop and dislodged the hard drive in such a way that I had to turn it off and fix the hard drive and put it all back together again. So my blood is about 30% adrenaline right now. So it's possible that I will talk faster than Alex, but I will try not to. When I asked Jirka for some time to talk about XInclude 1.1 and the work on XProc 2.0, I sort of thought I might get 10 minutes before a coffee break. And when the schedule came out and I finally looked at it, I discovered that I had two 20-minute sessions. I'm unconvinced that I can fill 40 minutes, but I will try. XInclude is a mechanism, is an XML vocabulary for including one XML document or a text document in another XML document. And recently, as in standards time, the last year or two, we have been working on XInclude 1.1, which has 3 significant improvements over XInclude 1.0. Support for fragment identifiers on text plain content being the first one. So if you're used to using XInclude to include portions of a program listing or something in an XML document for documentation purposes, you can now have the single monolithic, I'm going to use Java as an example, Java program, Java source file sitting somewhere and selectively include bits and pieces of it without physically cutting it up into bits. So you can include the actual compiled artifact, which is nice. In XInclude 1.0, you can only include text plain and XML content. In XInclude 1.1, we're generalizing that. We're saying it's possible to include other media types if you have fragment identifier syntaxes for them. And we have support for annotating the post-XIncluded info set, which I will explain in more detail in a few minutes. So here is, yeah, it's almost legible. So here is an example of using RFC 5147, the fragment identifier for text plain media types. I have used IDREF to point to the entire identity.java program that's a part of XML Calabash, my XProc tool. And I'm saying that I want to include this as text. And then the fragment identifier for this says that I want to include only lines 42 through 51 inclusive. And the length is a form of checksumming, a form of error checking. It's the length of identity.java. So what this means is if over time the files you're referring to change, then you'll be notified that XInclude will fail because it will detect that the file has changed in size. And if the file has changed in size, it's a good bet that you want to consider whether you're still including the right line numbers. And so here's what you get. I mean, I'm not going to show you all of identity.java, but it begins the way all Java programs do by importing 87 classes and a block of comments and a bunch of stuff. All I'm interested in is the run method, which does almost nothing in the case of identity. And here you can see I have managed to include just that portion of it. So that's RFC 5147 support. Seems like I've skipped a slide. Well, I haven't skipped a slide, I've just left something out. The parse attribute previously was XML or text, those strings literally. It now is a media type, so you can say parse equals image SVG if you want to use the fragment identifier syntax for SVG, for example, or image ping if you've got some way of reasonably including ping images in your XML content. The values XML and text are still interpreted as they were before, and any of the XML media types, that is application XML, text XML, or A/B plus XML are all interpreted as XML. The interpretation of the other values is implementation defined, but it is at least allowed now. And I should have pointed out, the slide that's missing is that the semantics of the xpointer attribute on XInclude is very clearly in 1.0 for xpointer, which is very clearly only about including XML resources. So the XInclude 1.1 spec includes a new attribute called Frag ID, which is a general purpose fragment identifier syntax. You can use one or the other. If you use both, they should be the same. If you use either one, they should work. let me go on. I've taken all of 5 minutes. That's great. The most significant change potentially in XInclude for folks who do documentation, which is mostly what I do with XML, is that it allows you to work around some of the perils of XInclude. Doing XInclude can introduce errors into your documents. In particular, if you XInclude the same blob of XML content in more than one place, and that blob of XML content includes an ID, you have introduced a validity error into the XIncluded document. You aren't allowed to have two IDs with the same value in an XML document. And it turns out that there's no single solution to this problem that would satisfy everybody all of the time. Jirka did a really nice write-up about some of these problems for the DocBook TC in a document called DocBook Transclusion, which enumerates a variety of options that you might want to use and the conditions under which you might want to use them. I'm going to show you some style sheets that I wrote that support that methodology. They're sort of DocBook specific at the moment, but there's nothing about them that couldn't be made more general, and so I may undertake to make them a little more general. The key feature that's missing from XInclude 1.0 to enable any of these things to be possible is that there's no way after XInclude 1.0 runs to tell where the boundaries were. You can't tell what's been copied in by XInclude and what hasn't. And without those boundaries, you can't apply any reasonable fixup. There's no generalized fixup you can apply because you don't know where the boundaries were. And XInclude 1.1 addresses this problem by allowing you to put annotations, that is, attributes on the XInclude element, and those get copied onto elements that are XIncluded for you. This only works for elements, so it isn't a perfect solution. If you XInclude a bunch of PIs or comments or text nodes or something, then that's not going to have the annotations on it because you can only put attributes on elements. But for a very large percentage of cases, this will provide significant functionality. So here we've got chapter.xml, which has a note in it. And I've decided that that note is important, and I'm going to use it in some other bit of content. And maybe I'm going to use it more than once in some other bit of content. And so I want to make sure that I can tell where this happened. So down here, I'm saying, fine, we're going to include this example, and we are going to parse it as XML. That means that the result will be an XML document with this new content stuck in it. I'm going to extract from this chapter only the thing marked as a note, with the ID of note, so I'm only going to get the note. And I'm saying I want to copy the attributes my root and my role, which I just made up for this purpose, onto the root elements that get copied in. So if you ran this XInclude element, the resulting info set would look like this. It would be the note from the chapter. It might possibly have XML base or XML ID on it. XML base or XML lang on it, depending on how XInclude fixup worked. But in addition, it will have the elements my root and my role on it. So if you add annotations to your XInclude elements in one step in your pipeline, whether it's a literal pipeline or just a figurative pipeline, then subsequent processing can find those boundaries by looking for those annotations. So that was XInclude 1.1, which went to CR a few months ago. I confess, had a couple of missing features that the working group decided not to attempt to address. One was that you couldn't copy attributes that weren't in a namespace, so you couldn't copy a role or a class attribute directly. It copied the XML attributes in the XML namespace along with attributes in any other namespace because we wanted to copy XML ID. Implementation experience being the leveler of all playing fields revealed that this just did not work. This was not speccable. What it meant to copy the XML base attribute from the XInclude element onto the included content was just an intractable mess. And so we have had to put out another last call for XInclude, excuse me, another last call. Another last call draft. I think the last call period has ended. But we made a few changes in XInclude 1.1, and this was actually what I was hoping to get to today in about 5 minutes. But if I talk for another 5 minutes, it'll take me 5 minutes. So the three changes in the latest last call are that we no longer copy attributes in the XML namespace. So we don't attempt to copy XML lang or XML base, which separates out a bunch of concerns that really were intractable in ways I don't actually remember at the moment. But that meant we couldn't copy the XML ID attribute, which was considered really, really important, so we decided that we would add a new attribute to XInclude called setXMLID, and this has the effect of setting the XML ID attribute on the included content to that value. And at that point, we decided that we would cave to some of the pressures to support copying attributes in no namespace by introducing yet another namespace. I'm sorry, that's the way life goes. And so in the second last call, you can do slightly more complicated things. There's a namespace for local attributes. And if you can say set the XML ID to something, you can say make the role attribute in no namespace have this value, and of course, the functionality I described earlier where you could copy attributes in a namespace still applies. So now, if you run this XInclude on the content we saw on the previous slide, you get an XML ID attribute with the value foo, you get a role attribute in no namespace with the value something, and you get the root attribute in the my namespace as well. All very lovely. I will show you what this means with a series of demos. So here is a book which includes 2 chapters, and both of the chapters include a warning from common.xml. And if we look at what's in common.xml, the warning says, beware the Jabberwock, my son, and has an XML ID of warning, which it needs to have because we want to point to it. And if I run XInclude on book.xml, what we get is a validation error because we have, I will show you the raw value before we do any fix-up. What we have done, what XInclude has done is it has inserted the warning where we asked it to with the ID warning and another warning with the ID warning, and that's not allowed. Bad boy, no biscuit. So, what instead, what is in here, right? Which book? I think it's book that contains the appropriate bit. Right, so in this example, I have added some attributes to XInclude. I've added ID fixup and link scope. And these are terms taken from Jirka's proposal for the various and sundry ways of combining things together for doing this kind of cleanup. And if we look at the pipeline now, in addition to doing XInclude, which is what it did before it does validation, it runs this transclusion fixup style sheet, which is able to see those annotations in the XIncluded source because XInclude 1.1 copies them over, and then it's able to adjust the values of IDs and attributes appropriately. So if I run make here, it will think for a little bit, and then it will output a valid document because telling it to use link scope local has, telling it to use, which one was it? Right, telling it to do ID fixup of auto has automatically inserted IDs, and the link scope of global means that we haven't changed any of the link ends. So what we've got now is a different XML ID value on the repeated warning, but link scope is global, so we haven't changed any of the link end elements. And so now all the link ends that point to warning point to the first warning in the book, which is the behavior you would have gotten anyway if you'd ignored the ID errors and pressed mightily along. One more example. In this case, I'm going to do auto ID fixup again, but in this case, I'm going to say link scope is near. And what the semantics of that are, any link end should be rewritten so that it points to the closest ID of that, with the closest renamed ID to the original. So if I run make here, I forget off the top of my head how closest is measured. I think number of intervening siblings or something. So in this case, because I said to do ID fixup in both cases, both of the IDs have been changed. And now both of the link ends have also been changed. And now this warning points to the one closest to it, and this warning points to the other one that's closest to it. So That's just sort of an example of how you can use these features. I don't think there's a demo for. If there is, I wouldn't know what's in it. No, okay. So that's a short demonstration of some of the features in XInclude 1.1. There is one other thing we need to get out of CR. We need a second implementation. You have to have two implementations to get something to rec in the W3C process. And I have an implementation, and if I squint really hard, I can imagine that it's legitimate for me to produce a second implementation and then call that two different implementations. But in an ideal world, somebody else would also implement XInclude 1.1 and make my life easier and happier. It's not actually terribly challenging, but it has to be in a code base well enough, well enough to implement or tinker with the current implementation of XInclude. Somebody who wanted to do it in Xerxes would make me very happy indeed. But anybody who does it anywhere would make me happy. I think that's all I've got to say about XInclude. Can it be implemented in XSLT? Probably not because of the, well, maybe, but you'd have to deal with the RFC 5147 fragment identifiers and counting lines in the text file and things. It might be possible to implement an XSLT. I didn't choose to do that, but it might be. Yeah, that's what I was going to do. I was going to say we can see if anybody has any questions about XInclude before I prattle on a bit about XProg.
So is anyone else except Mike has questions related to XInclude 1.1? Over there.
Hi Norm, it's Charles Foster here. XInclude is cool, I love it. And I'd personally love to start using XInclude 1.1 now, if I could, in Java. So your current implementation of XInclude 1.1, is that absolutely and utterly interlinked with Calabash right now, or can you take it out as like a separate SAX pass or something like that?
It's inextricably linked to the Saxon API data models because it's built on the assumption that the XDM is what it's operating on. The Saxon XDM node is what it's working on. But I believe the two or three methods that actually do the work are entirely extricable from the step. You could take them, you could extract them and write your own object that did this if you wanted to. I could possibly be persuaded to refactor it that way myself for a beer or something. But at the moment, it's part of the step.
All right. Quick question about namespaces. Can you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
In the output, where is the namespace declaration for the my prefix? How is this supposed to work? Is this conflict in prefixes? Is this a spec problem or an implementation problem?
This is a I typed a slide in and left the namespace out. The namespace fixup that applies to any of these things would apply here. Yeah. And yes, if the my prefix wasn't in scope already, it would be declared on that element.
Okay. Okay.
Any other question? Okay, George. Just George, please wait for a microphone because we are streaming.
Just to follow up on this, if you declare a new namespace then on this node, then the content needs to be fixed up also, what's within the node, because that may also have, I don't know.
I mean, the result of doing this will be that you'll have attributes named myRoot on this element and a namespace declaration if it's necessary. So if there's other content inside there with the namespace prefix my, it's going to, it will have the one from before, and the namespace declarations will be declared and redeclared in an annoying way.
Is there also any support for removing an attribute? I mean, like you have, for no namespace, but you want to say, I want a node, but without this attribute.
No, there's no support for removing them. There's just support for adding them. If you add one that's already there, it will be replaced, but you can't remove it.
Okay.
Yeah, there were some requests for it, but we thought that it's quite marginal requirement, and you can implement it yourself by adding some attribute in your namespace listing, for example, a list of attributes which have to be removed. But
yes. Yes, a tricky case could be that you already, instead of node, you have my node with a my, which is a different one from the my of the attributes. What would happen in that case?
Beats me. Somebody, I'll make a note of that and see. I'm not. It's possible the spec says what would happen, but I couldn't swear to it off the top of my head.
One more question.
Okay, probably it will be last question.
Here.
Yep.
Is it possible to select a fragment with the namespace expression with the XInclude?
XInclude doesn't say anything about what X-pointer schemes are allowed in the Frag ID or X-pointer attributes. Most of the implementations I'm aware of do support the XPath scheme. It's the one I use all the time. So
yes.
It's a quality of implementation issue, but basically, usually, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank